In the summer of 1692, the quiet village of Salem, Massachusetts, became the stage for one of the darkest dramas in American history. Neighbors who once shared meals and prayers suddenly turned against one another. Children's strange fits were taken as proof of witchcraft. Ministers warned of invisible devils stalking the town, and within months, the small Puritan settlement descended into a frenzy that left 20 people dead and many more lives ruined. But Salem's story is not just about superstition and hysteria. It is about power and fear, faith and control, and how a community's desperate search for purity nearly destroyed itself from within. This is not a tale of witches at all. It is a tale of human choices made in the shadows of fear, ambition, and belief that still echo through American culture to this day. Tonight, we will travel back to the streets of Salem. We will uncover how it all began, why it spiraled out of control, and what hidden truths have been left behind after more than 3 centuries of retelling. This is the complete saga of the Salem Witch Trials, unmasked, piece by piece. In the late 17th century, Salem Village sat on the rugged edge of New England, a settlement only a few decades old, but already heavy with divisions and anxieties. The people who lived there were Puritans, descendants of English Protestants who had crossed the Atlantic, seeking freedom to worship God as they believed was right. But with that freedom came strict discipline. To be a Puritan in Salem was to live in a world where faith shaped every detail of life. A sermon might stretch for hours. Every crop planted, every illness endured, every sudden death was believed to be under the direct gaze of divine judgment. Daily life was hard, carved from thick forests and harsh winters. Families rose before dawn, tending livestock, hauling water, and working long hours in fields and homes. Children were expected to obey without question. Leisure was rare. Music and dancing, unless tied to religious devotion, were frowned upon. The wilderness surrounding Salem was not just a landscape, but a spiritual battleground, a place where native raids, wild animals, and the lurking presence of the devil were all imagined to dwell. The community itself was close-knit, yet fragile. Neighbors depended on one another for survival, borrowing tools, sharing food, and watching each other's children. At the same time, jealousy and suspicion simmered just below the surface. A broken fence or a stray cow could spark feuds lasting years, resentments over land boundaries, inheritance disputes, or church authority could divide entire families. In a world where unity was preached, but scarcity was constant, every grudge carried weight. At the center of it all was religion. The Puritans believed they were God's chosen people, tasked with building a model society in the wilderness. Salem was more than a town. It was meant to be a shining example of order and obedience in a world they believed was full of sin. Ministers warned constantly that the devil prowled nearby, seeking to tear the community apart. This belief was not metaphorical. To the Puritans, Satan was as real as the soil they tilled or the snow that buried their farms each winter. Witchcraft was not a superstition whispered in corners, but a deadly threat, punishable by death and thought to be one of the devil's favorite tools. This was the soil in which the Salem Witch Trials would one day grow, a society isolated, fearful, deeply faithful, and already divided against itself. Long before the accusations began, Salem was primed for a crisis, one spark away from fire. To understand Salem in 1692, one must first step into the Puritan mind. Theirs was not a world divided neatly between faith and reason, religion and daily life. Instead, every moment of existence was entangled with the spiritual. Illness was not simply an infection of the body, but potentially a punishment from God. A sudden storm destroying a harvest could be seen as a divine warning. Even the faintest whisper of misfortune might be interpreted as evidence of sin. Central to Puritan belief was the conviction that the devil was real and active. He was not distant or symbolic, but a living presence, working tirelessly to corrupt God's people. To the Puritans, Satan's influence was visible in everything from wayward thoughts to unexplained accidents, and his greatest weapon was witchcraft. They believed witches formed secret covenants with the devil, trading their souls for power and using dark magic to harm neighbors, livestock, or even entire communities. Scripture reinforced these fears. The Bible spoke of witches as abominations to be cut off from the land of the living. Ministers in New England repeated these warnings from their pulpits, reminding congregations that God's wrath could fall on an entire village if witchcraft went unpunished. To ignore it was to invite disaster. This mindset left little room for doubt. If someone fell ill after a quarrel with a neighbor, suspicion could easily turn toward witchcraft. If cattle died, if crops failed, or if a child wasted away without explanation, the devil's hand was assumed to be at work. Logic and evidence mattered far less than belief and fear. And yet, within this worldview, there was a constant tension. The Puritans prided themselves on building a godly community, a city upon a hill, watched by the world. But underneath lay an unspoken dread that no matter how hard they prayed, how faithfully they worked, or how strictly they obeyed, they could never fully escape the devil's grasp. The harder they clung to purity, the more they feared corruption. This fragile balance between confidence in their chosen destiny and terror of the devil's schemes was the foundation of Salem's tragedy. When strange fits began in a minister's household, it was not seen as sickness or stress, but as an assault by Satan himself. In that moment, all of their deepest fears would rush into the open, feeding a storm that no one could control. At first glance, Salem in the 1690s might seem like a single community, but in reality, it was two worlds uneasily tied together. Salem town, a bustling port tied to Atlantic trade, and Salem village, a struggling agricultural settlement on its outskirts. Salem town thrived on commerce. Ships carried lumber, fish, and furs to markets as far away as England and the Caribbean. Merchants grew wealthy, taverns buzzed with travelers, and new ideas flowed in from across the seas. It was cosmopolitan by Puritan standards, a place where ambition and worldly success were visible signs of God's blessing. Salem village, just a few miles inland, was different. Its residents were farmers, hard-working, devout, and suspicious of the growing materialism of the town. Life was harsher, more isolated, and more dependent on unity, but unity was scarce. Villagers often disagreed on where their loyalty should lie. Some leaned toward the town, hoping to benefit from trade and prosperity. Others clung to their farming roots and resented the town's growing influence. This divide was more than economic, it was cultural and spiritual. Town merchants attended Salem town's meeting house, where sermons often emphasized prosperity as a sign of God's favor. Many villagers, however, pushed for their own church, wanting stricter preaching and tighter control over religious life. The split became so bitter that by the 1670s, Salem village had its own congregation. But even that did not end the fighting. Who should lead it? How strict should it be? And how closely should it align with Salem town's interests? This fracture between town and village left the community vulnerable. Resentments festered for years. Some saw neighbors as too worldly, too greedy, too willing to compromise. Others saw the stricter villagers as fanatics who dragged the community backward. When fear and suspicion finally struck, these old tensions would guide where fingers pointed and who became vulnerable to accusation. The Salem Witch Trials were not born in a vacuum. They were the culmination of decades of struggle between a village clinging to purity and a town chasing prosperity, between old values and new ambitions, between neighbors who no longer trusted one another. If Salem Village was already uneasy with Salem Town, it was even more divided within its own borders. Beneath the surface of farms and meeting houses, the village seethed with personal rivalries and factional disputes. These conflicts, over land, inheritance, and church authority, would later shape who accused and who was accused when the witch trials erupted. Land was the lifeblood of Puritan families. It determined wealth, status, and survival. Boundaries were fiercely guarded, yet poorly marked in the forests and fields of New England. A neighbor's cow straying across a property line, or a disagreement over where a fence should stand, could ignite lawsuits and bitter feuds lasting years. The Porters, a prosperous family, allied with Salem Town, and the Putnams, staunch supporters of Salem Village's independence, became the most powerful factions. Each had allies and enemies, and their disputes colored nearly every village decision. Inheritance deepened the tension. In a society where farms passed from one generation to the next, disputes among siblings and cousins could splinter families. If one branch prospered, another might seethe with resentment. Accusations of witchcraft later often mirrored these old grievances, as though the trials gave neighbors a legal weapon to settle unfinished business. Then, there was the question of religion. The Puritans had come to New England for the freedom to worship in their own strict manner, but even among them, disagreements raged over doctrine and discipline. Salem Village's struggle to establish its own church dragged on for years, with ministers arriving, clashing with parishioners, and leaving again. Each new leader seemed to widen the rift rather than heal it. By the time Reverend Parris took charge in 1689, the village was already split between those who supported his rigid authority and those who despised his demands. These disputes were not forgotten. They lingered, simmering beneath the ordinary rhythm of farm life. When children began to cry out against witches, villagers did not point at strangers, they pointed at neighbors, often the very people with whom their families had quarreled for years. The witch trials, in many ways, were the eruption of long-festering divisions. Old grudges, given new form under the fear of the devil, would drive Salem into chaos. To understand why Salem unraveled so quickly, one must look beyond its internal disputes and consider the climate of fear pressing in from all sides. The late 17th century was an age of instability, and for the Puritans of Massachusetts, nearly every horizon seemed threatening. From the north and west came the terror of war, Native American raids, fueled by decades of land, conflict, and intensified by King William's War. Left frontier settlements burned, families slaughtered, and survivors carrying harrowing tales back to Salem. Refugees poured into the village, speaking of homes destroyed and loved ones lost. Their stories were not just tragic, they reinforced the idea that the devil himself was at work in the wilderness, using native tribes as his instruments of destruction. For a small, already divided community, this was more than rumor. It was a reminder that death and chaos were never far away. Politically, the colony itself was unstable. The royal charter that once gave Massachusetts Bay a measure of independence had been revoked, plunging the colony into uncertainty. New governors appointed by the crown arrived with little understanding of Puritan values, sowing resentment and confusion. Taxes, trade restrictions, and questions of authority all pressed on the colonists. Many feared that their once city upon a hill was crumbling under outside control. Even nature seemed to conspire against them. Harsh winters destroyed crops, and disease crept through households, striking children without warning. In a society that read every misfortune as a possible sign of God's anger, these disasters were never merely accidents. They were warnings, punishments, or perhaps evidence that witches had unleashed the devil's power against their neighbors. Fear became the constant backdrop of life in Salem. Fear of war, fear of poverty, fear of God's wrath, fear of the devil. It was not one single catastrophe, but a steady accumulation of anxieties, pressing tighter and tighter on a community already divided. When the first mysterious afflictions appeared in Reverend Parris's household, they did not strike a peaceful, secure village. They struck a place already trembling with dread. Salem was primed for hysteria, and fear would be the fuel that turned suspicion into accusation, and accusation into death. At the center of the storm that would engulf Salem was the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. Arriving in 1689, Parris was not the unifying leader the village longed for. Stern, defensive, and often quarrelsome, he quickly divided his parishioners. He demanded strict obedience, quarreled with members who resisted his authority, and constantly warned that Satan prowled at the edges of the community. Some found him inspiring, others found him intolerable, but no one could ignore him. His household reflected the wider struggles of Salem village. Living under his roof were his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, and his enslaved servant, Tetaba, originally from the Caribbean. In the long, cold winter of 1692, these figures, one a child, one an adolescent, and one a marginalized woman with little power, would become the unlikely spark of a tragedy that consumed an entire colony. Life inside the parsonage was tense. Parris faced constant disputes with his congregation, and his financial struggles left him bitter and defensive. The family lived under the weight of religious strictness, with little room for joy or reprieve. The long winter months, filled with hardship and uncertainty, pressed heavily on children with restless energy and limited outlets. It was here, in this atmosphere, that Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began to exhibit strange behaviors. They screamed, convulsed, and claimed unseen forces tormented them. Neighbors whispered, parents prayed. Some wondered if the girls had been dabbling in forbidden games, perhaps with Tituba's stories of folk magic from her homeland. Others saw something darker, the hand of Satan reaching directly into the minister's home. In Puritan belief, such afflictions were never random. If children were seized by invisible torments, the devil was surely near. And if the devil had found a foothold in Reverend Parris's household, the very heart of the community's religious life, then nowhere in Salem was safe. The parsonage, already a house of conflict, became the birthplace of panic. From its walls, fear spilled outward into the village, carrying with it the seeds of accusation that would soon grow into hysteria. In January of 1692, the village first heard whispers that something uncanny was unfolding in the Parris home. Reverend Parris's daughter, Betty, and his niece, Abigail Williams, began to suffer sudden and violent fits. Their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, twisting and thrashing as though seized by unseen hands. They screamed without cause, their cries echoing through the parsonage. At times, they fell into trances, staring blankly at nothing, unresponsive to family members, trying desperately to rouse them. Witnesses were unsettled. These were not ordinary childhood tantrums or fainting spells. The girls shouted that they were being pinched or bitten, though no marks appeared on their skin. They hid under furniture, shrieked at invisible shapes, and claimed that specters tormented them. Soon, their strange afflictions spread to other young girls in Salem village, each showing the same wild behaviors. What began in a single household rippled outward, like a contagion moving through the community. To modern eyes, their symptoms might raise questions of stress, illness, or suggestion, but in the Puritan world, there was only one explanation. If doctors could not find a natural cause, then the devil himself must be at work. Reverend Parris, called upon local physicians, and when no cure could be offered, their verdict was chilling. The girls were under the influence of witchcraft. This diagnosis transformed the situation. What had begun as a family mystery became a village crisis. Fear spread quickly. If the devil could seize children in the minister's own house, then no one in Salem was beyond his reach. Parents began watching their own children nervously. Neighbors whispered about who might be responsible. The afflicted girls, writhing and screaming, became living proof of invisible evil in their midst. The stage was set. With the authority of the church and the verdict of the physicians, the people of Salem no longer asked whether witchcraft was real. They asked only who in their community had opened the door for the devil to enter. As the affliction spread among the young girls of Salem, the village fell into a state of anxious speculation. Everyone wanted an explanation, and in a community shaped by scripture and fear, the options seemed limited. Doctors had already declared that no natural illness could explain the fits. That left only the supernatural. The Puritan worldview left little room for ambiguity. If the devil was at work, he must be working through someone. Witches, they believed, were real people, neighbors, perhaps even family members, who had made a covenant with Satan. Such people could send spirits to torment victims, strike down livestock, or blight crops without ever leaving their homes. This belief gave shape to the girls' afflictions. Their cries of torment were not only symptoms of illness, but accusations in themselves. Someone was responsible. The afflicted girls, when pressed, began to hint at unseen figures tormenting them. They cried out that shadows whispered in their ears. They claimed specters struck them or perched at the foot of their beds. These descriptions were vague, but the community hung on every word, desperate for clues. Parents and neighbors gathered around, demanding names, pressing the children to reveal who was hurting them. It was in this moment of fear and pressure that the line between suffering and accusation blurred. A scream in the night could become a testimony. A frightened child's murmur could set suspicion on a neighbor. And as the village leaned in closer, demanding to know who was behind the afflictions, the girls began to identify faces. The search for explanations had transformed into a search for culprits. Salem, once gripped by uncertainty, was shifting towards certainty of the most dangerous kind, that witches were among them, and they could be named. The news spread quickly. Salem village, already bound by gossip and watchful eyes, buzzed with whispers about the strange happenings in the minister's household. What began as curiosity soon hardened into alarm. Families spoke of the devil with renewed urgency. Farmers paused in their fields to exchange fearful rumors. Mothers held their children closer at night, praying for protection against forces they could not see. As the afflicted girls continued their convulsions and trances, the spectacle became public. Villagers crowded into the parsonage to witness the outbursts firsthand. Some saw children writhing and thought only of Satan's grip. Others noticed that the girls seemed to grow worse when certain people entered the room. These observations, often shaped by existing tensions or grudges, carried enormous weight. To suggest that a specific neighbor made the afflicted recoil was to hint that witchcraft was at play. The alarm deepened because these events touched the very heart of the community. If even the minister's home was vulnerable to the devil's work, what hope was there for ordinary families? And if children could be so visibly tormented, then perhaps no household was safe. The unease grew contagious. Villagers reported strange sights, shadows flitting at the edge of candlelight, livestock behaving oddly, sudden illnesses without cause. Every unexplained moment now seemed charged with dark meaning. Fear thickened the air, and suspicion became a natural reflex. The village was no longer simply worried. It was on edge, waiting for proof of the devil's agents among them. All it would take was a name, one person accused, to turn fear into open hysteria, and that moment was about to arrive. By late February of 1692, fear had reached a breaking point. The afflicted girls were no longer only suffering. They were speaking, pressed by adults, questioned by neighbors, and watched by a community desperate for answers. They began to identify who they believed was tormenting them. The first names shocked some, but confirmed long-held suspicions for others. The initial accusations fell on 3 women who stood at the edges of Salem society. Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved servant from the Caribbean, was the most obvious target. She was foreign, marginalized, and known to tell stories of spirits and folk traditions that fed the imagination of children. To many Puritans, her difference made her suspect before a word was spoken. Alongside her were Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Sarah Good was a beggar, often seen wandering from house to house with her young child surviving on the charity of neighbors. She was sharp-tongued, quick to argue, and resented for her poverty. Sarah Osborne, in contrast, had once been respectable but had fallen from grace after marrying a servant and embroiling herself in bitter inheritance disputes. To Salem's villagers, both women represented disorder, people who defied or failed to live within Puritan expectations. The girls cried out that these women's specters pinched, bit, and tormented them. Their testimonies, racked with convulsions and shrieks, carried a power that no ordinary accusation could match. And in a community already primed to see the devil's hand, these names seemed to confirm what many feared: witches lived among them. For Salem, this was the turning point. Fear shifted into action. Once names were spoken, the community felt compelled to respond. To ignore such accusations would be to invite God's wrath on the entire village. Investigations began, warrants were issued, and within days, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne would face public interrogation, marking the first step in a chain of trials and executions that would consume Salem. The hunt had begun. In early March 1692, Salem gathered to witness a spectacle unlike anything the village had seen before. The accused women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, were brought forward to be questioned before magistrates. These examinations were not quiet legal hearings. They were charged, public events, filled with tension, fear, and a sense of theater that gripped the entire community. Villagers packed into meeting houses to watch. On one side sat the magistrates, stern-faced and armed with authority. On the other stood the accused, women whose reputations already carried the stains of poverty, scandal, or difference. And before them, the afflicted girls shrieked, convulsed, and cried out, as if the very presence of the accused brought invisible torment upon them. The questioning was harsh, designed not to uncover truth, but to press confessions. Sarah Good was scorned for her poverty and sharp tongue. Sarah Osborne, weakened by illness, struggled to defend herself against accusations that she had turned away from the church. Tituba, isolated and enslaved, faced the heaviest scrutiny. Every gesture became evidence. If the girls collapsed in agony when a suspect raised her hand, it was taken as proof of witchcraft. If an accused woman hesitated to answer, it was seen as guilt. Even silence could be damning, interpreted as the devil holding her tongue. The examinations blurred the line between justice and performance, feeding the villagers' fears rather than easing them. For the people of Salem, these events confirmed what they already believed: witches were real, and they were here. And once the community accepted this premise, the logic of fear became unstoppable. If 3 witches could be found in a village so small, how many more were hidden in plain sight? The examinations had done their work. Salem was no longer debating whether witchcraft existed. It was preparing for a full-scale hunt. What happened next would push Salem from suspicion into hysteria. Under relentless questioning, Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, broke. At first, She denied the accusations, but pressed harder, threatened with punishment, and trapped in a system where innocence was no protection. She gave the magistrates what they wanted, a confession. But it was not a simple admission. Tituba spun a story that electrified the room. She said that the devil had indeed come to Salem. She spoke of a tall man in dark clothes who demanded she serve him. She described strange creatures, red cats, black dogs, yellow birds, that obeyed his command. She claimed that witches flew through the night, signing Satan's book and plotting to destroy the Puritan community. Her words landed with devastating effect. In a society already convinced the devil walked among them, this confession was not dismissed as fantasy. It was heard as proof. The afflicted girls screamed in agreement, convulsing as though confirming her tale with their own suffering. The magistrates leaned in, asking for more details. How many witches were there? Who were they? Where did they meet? Tituba answered in ways that only deepened the mystery, saying there were others, that she could not name them all. This was the moment Salem's fear transformed into frenzy. A confession meant that witchcraft was not only real but active, coordinated, and spreading. Tituba had painted a picture of a conspiracy, a hidden army of witches working together to destroy the village. To the people of Salem, this meant no one could be safe and no one could be above suspicion. The significance of her confession cannot be overstated. It gave the magistrates justification to pursue the hunt. It validated the afflicted girl's torments, and it expanded the threat from a few outcasts to the possibility of dozens, maybe hundreds, of witches lurking in their midst. In that charged moment, the community's imagination leapt from isolated afflictions to an invisible war against the devil, and Salem would never be the same again. After towed of confession, Salem could no longer contain itself. Fear, once simmering, erupted into an open flood of accusations. The afflicted girls named more people, and soon others joined in, pointing fingers at neighbors, rivals, and anyone who seemed suspicious. Each new claim fueled the belief that a vast network of witches had infiltrated the village. At first, the targets were those already living on the margins: beggars, the elderly, women known for their sharp tempers or unconventional behavior. But as the panic grew, suspicion spread outward, touching people once considered respectable. Landowners, church members, even the wives of leaders found themselves accused. No one was too poor to escape notice, and no one was too powerful to be safe. The process gained its own momentum. Every accusation added weight to the last. If one girl collapsed in fits when a villager entered the room, another might scream the same, convinced or compelled by the hysteria around her. Spectral visions, phantoms seen only by the afflicted, became evidence enough to brand a neighbor a witch. Rumors, half-remembered quarrels, and old grudges transformed into testimonies. The fear spread beyond Salem village. Surrounding towns heard of the crisis and began reporting their own suspicions. People whispered of dark shapes in the night, of cattle dying without cause, of butter curdling inexplicably in churns. In every misfortune, the devil's hand was seen. The prisons filled. Cells meant for thieves and debtors now held dozens of accused witches, shackled in iron and awaiting judgment. Families were torn apart as husbands and wives were separated, children left to fend for themselves, and property abandoned. What had begun with a few afflicted girls and 3 marginalized women was now consuming entire communities. Each accusation widened the circle, tightening the net until no one could predict who might be next. And with every new name added to the list, Salem sank deeper into the belief that the devil's conspiracy was real, vast, and closing in on them all. As accusations multiplied, Salem's leaders faced a crucial question: what counted as proof of witchcraft. In ordinary circumstances, courts required physical evidence or reliable witness testimony. But in Salem, there was little of either. No charms or potions were found. No gatherings of witches uncovered. What they did have were the visions and cries of the afflicted girls. And in 1692, that was enough. The magistrates accepted what came to be known as spectral evidence, the claim that a witch's spirit or spectre could torment victims even when the accused was far away. If a girl fell to the ground screaming that she saw a neighbor's spirit striking her, the court treated it as real and binding testimony. The accused might insist they were at home, asleep in bed, or working in their fields. But the court reasoned that witches could leave their bodies to attack others invisibly. This practice turned fear into law. Ordinary villagers, already terrified of being targeted, now realized that the flimsiest accusation could ruin them. There was no defense against spectral evidence. How could one prove that another person's vision was false? How could anyone disprove a dream? Spectral evidence made the trials unstoppable. It gave authority to the afflicted girls, elevating their fits and screams into courtroom verdicts. It gave magistrates a justification for pursuing case after case, confident they were doing God's work. And it gave accusers a powerful weapon, since settling old grudges or seizing advantage could now be cloaked in the language of spiritual attack. But it also planted the seeds of doubt. Some ministers, even among the Puritans, worried that accepting visions as proof opened the door to deception. If the devil was truly cunning, could he not make innocent people appear guilty? To a few, this possibility was terrifying. But in the heat of Salem's panic, such concerns were drowned out. Spectral evidence would become the beating heart of the Salem Witch Trials, a method that turned suspicion into certainty and ensured that the gallows would not stand empty for long. By the spring of 1692, the accusations had grown so numerous that Salem's small jail could no longer contain the prisoners. Shackled and chained, the accused witches were marched not only into Salem's lockup, but also into the surrounding towns and even Boston itself. Prisons meant for petty thieves and debtors now groaned with the weight of dozens of men, women, and even children awaiting trial. The conditions were brutal. Cold stone floors, damp air, and iron shackles made survival difficult. Prisoners slept in cramped quarters, often with little more than straw between them and the filth of the cell. Food was scarce, usually provided only if family or friends brought it. For those too poor or too despised to receive support, hunger gnawed daily. Disease spread easily in such conditions, and some accused witches never made it to trial, dying anonymously behind bars. Families suffered alongside them. Husbands were left to tend farms alone, while wives languished in chains. Children begged neighbors for food when their parents could no longer provide. In some cases, infants were locked up with their mothers, enduring the same freezing nights and meager rations. Entire households collapsed under the strain. Meanwhile, the sheer number of prisoners fueled the hysteria rather than calming it. To many Puritans, the overflowing jails were proof of how deeply the devil's conspiracy had infected their community. If so many witches could be discovered in just a few months, how vast must the hidden network be? The sight of chains, crowded cells, and shackled neighbors only hardened the belief that the devil had sent an army against Salem. For the accused, hope dimmed. Once arrested, few could expect release. Bail was rare, trials moved slowly, and the pressure to confess mounted daily. Prison was not merely a holding place. It was a crucible of fear, despair, and humiliation, where reputations died long before bodies reached the gallows. Salem was no longer a village wrestling with rumor. It was a community whose institutions, its jails, its churches, its courts, were being consumed by the hunt for witches. and the machinery was only just beginning to turn. By May of 1692, the crisis had grown too large for local magistrates to handle, with jails overflowing and accusations multiplying. Governor William Phips established a special tribunal to deal with the witchcraft cases. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the Old French meaning to hear and determine. Its sole purpose was to confront the rising tide of witchcraft charges that threatened to overwhelm the colony. This was no ordinary court. Its very creation signaled to the people of Massachusetts that the crisis was real and urgent, demanding extraordinary measures. The judges chosen to preside were some of the colony's most powerful figures: Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, a man of stern conviction and little patience for doubt; Samuel Sewall, respected but deeply pious; and several others who carried with them reputations for strictness and loyalty to Puritan orthodoxy. From the beginning, the court was shaped by fear rather than caution. Unlike modern trials, there were no defense attorneys, no presumption of innocence, and no protection against hearsay or rumor. The afflicted girl's testimonies, filled with cries and visions, were treated as direct evidence. Confessions, even those extracted under pressure, were accepted as proof of guilt, not only against the confessor, but also against anyone they named. The establishment of this court institutionalized the hysteria. What had begun as scattered village disputes now carried the full weight of colonial government. Each case became a stage on which the struggle between God and the devil was acted out before the eyes of the community. Salem's witch crisis was no longer a local panic. It was now a sanctioned battle, with gallows and prisons waiting for the outcome. For the accused, the creation of the Court of Oyer and Terminer was a death knell. To be tried there was to face not only suspicion, but also a system designed to confirm it. The machinery of justice had been turned into a weapon of fear, and it would soon claim its first victims. The judges of the Court of Oyer and Terminer were not simply men applying law. They were men of faith, steeped in the Puritan conviction that they stood on the front lines of a cosmic struggle between God and the devil. Their decisions were shaped not only by evidence, but by their worldview, one that saw witchcraft as a deadly threat to the survival of their society. Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, who presided over the court, embodied this mindset: stern, unyielding, and deeply devout. He believed that hesitation in the face of witchcraft was itself dangerous. To Stoughton, doubts were not virtues. They were temptations that risked allowing Satan to gain ground. He pushed for swift convictions, confident that he was protecting the colony by striking hard against witches. Other judges, like Samuel Sewall and John Richards, shared similar convictions, though not all were equally zealous. Some wrestled with the morality of accepting spectral evidence, but the fear of ignoring what might be the devil's work outweighed their reluctance. The ministers who advised the court, including Cotton Mather, reinforced this urgency. Cotton argued that the devil was cunning and relentless, and that vigilance was the colony's only defense. His writings and sermons gave the court theological justification for its harsh measures. These men saw themselves as guardians of a fragile, godly society. New England, in their eyes, was not just a colony, it was a covenant with God, a sacred experiment in building a pure Christian community. If witches were allowed to flourish within it, the entire enterprise might collapse under divine wrath. The trials were not simply about crime, they were about survival. Yet in their certainty lay the tragedy. The judges believed they were preserving Salem, but their faith in the invisible, their reliance on spectral evidence, and their eagerness to confirm guilt turned their courtroom into an engine of destruction. Each verdict they pronounced widened the panic, feeding the very fear they thought they were curing. In their eyes, the gallows stood as instruments of justice. To history, they stand as symbols of how belief and authority, when fused with fear, can bring ruin. On June 10, 1692, Salem crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. After weeks of hearings, examinations, and mounting hysteria, the court of Oyer and Terminer pronounced its first death sentence. The accused was Bridget Bishop, a woman long known in the village for her independence, outspoken nature, and disregard for Puritan norms. She wore bright clothing, ran a tavern, and carried a reputation for defiance, traits that made her an easy target in a society that prized obedience and modesty. During her trial, the afflicted girls collapsed into fits at the sight of her, claiming her spectre clawed and choked them. Neighbors testified to strange misfortunes after quarrels with her, chickens dying, butter spoiling, children falling ill. Bishop denied every charge, insisting she was innocent. But against the weight of spectral evidence and testimony colored by years of suspicion, her words carried little power. When the verdict was read, guilty of practicing witchcraft, Bridget Bishop became the first to face the gallows. On that June morning, she was led to Gallows Hill, a barren rise just outside the village. Crowds gathered, solemn and fearful, to watch. For the judges, the ministers, and many of the villagers, this execution was not merely punishment. It was a ritual of purification, a statement that Salem would root out the devil's servants no matter the cost. The rope was placed around her neck, prayers were offered, and the trap was released. Bridget Bishop's death marked the beginning of Salem's darkest summer. Her execution sent shockwaves through the colony. For some, it confirmed the reality of the crisis. If witches could be convicted and executed, then the danger was real and urgent. For others, a quiet unease stirred. If the court could condemn someone so firmly on visions and suspicion, who among them was truly safe? The gallows had claimed their first life, and the precedent was set. Salem would not turn back. Each hanging that followed would seem easier than the last, and the machinery of fear would only grow stronger. After Bridget Bishop's death, Salem entered a season of terror unlike anything it had known before. Her hanging did not ease the community's fears. It magnified them. If one witch had been executed, surely many more remained hidden, plotting with the devil, and with each passing week, the number of accusations grew, spreading beyond Salem village into neighboring towns and even across county lines. The trials quickened, names were spoken in court almost daily, and each new accusation seemed to confirm the existence of a vast conspiracy. Entire families came under suspicion. Husbands accused wives, children accused parents, neighbors testified against one another, dredging up old disputes and painting them in the shadow of witchcraft. The boundary between personal grievance and supernatural suspicion all but disappeared. The court, convinced it was fighting for the survival of the colony, showed no hesitation. With every execution, it believed it was striking another blow against Satan's army. But the more it struck, the more enemies it seemed to find. Spectral evidence continued to dominate the trials, with the afflicted girls collapsing, shrieking, and claiming to see spirits of the accused tormenting them. To the judges, these dramatic outbursts were confirmation. To the villagers, they were terrifying proof that witches still lurked everywhere. By July and August, the gallows were no longer a rare sight. One execution had become 5, then 10, each one attended by somber crowds. Bodies swung from the rope, while families wept at the base of the hill, powerless to save them. For the accused who maintained their innocence, death was inevitable. For those who confessed under pressure, there was hope of reprieve, but only if they named others, feeding the chain of accusations that widened the net even further. Salem was unraveling. Fields went untended as farmers were jailed or executed. Children wandered hungry when parents were imprisoned. The ordinary rhythms of life, planting, harvesting, worship, were overshadowed by the constant drumbeat of trials and executions. Fear dominated every conversation. No one could predict who might be accused next, and no one could confidently claim safety. What had begun as a few afflictions in a minister's household had spiraled into a colony-wide panic with no end in sight, and the gallows, now well used, stood as a grim reminder that Salem's battle against the devil was far from over. The gallows became the most chilling symbol of Salem's hysteria, perched on a barren rise, now known as Gallows Hill. It loomed over the village as both a stage and a warning. Each execution day drew crowds from miles around, men, women, and children gathering to witness what they believed was God's justice unfolding before their eyes. For the authorities, the gallows served a dual purpose. They were instruments of punishment, but also of purification. Each hanging was presented as a cleansing act, a necessary sacrifice to rid the community of the devil's influence. Ministers led prayers, urging repentance not only from the condemned, but from the onlookers, reminding them that vigilance was the only defense against Satan's schemes. The condemned were brought in carts, escorted by guards, often bound in chains. Some prayed aloud, proclaiming their innocence to the very end. Others remained silent, too weary or broken to speak. A few who had confessed under duress begged forgiveness, believing their souls hung in the balance even more than their bodies. The hangings were swift, but left a lasting mark. Bodies swayed in the wind as crowds stood in uneasy silence. For some, the sight brought reassurance that justice had been done. For others, it stirred private doubts. If these were truly witches, why did so many face death, proclaiming innocence with such conviction? The gallows also left scars on families. Loved ones were not permitted proper burials. The bodies of the executed were cut down and buried in shallow, unmarked graves near the site. Families who tried to recover them risked public scorn or punishment. The dead were denied dignity, and the living carried shame that could not easily be erased. Over the summer of 1692, the gallows claimed 19 lives. Each execution etched fear deeper into the hearts of Salem's people. With every rope pulled tight, the message rang clear. No one was beyond suspicion, and no one was guaranteed safety. The hill became more than a place of death. It became a mirror of Salem's fear and fury, a stage where faith, justice, and terror collided under the eyes of a desperate community. From the beginning, women stood at the center of Salem's witchcraft crisis. They were the majority of the accused, the majority of the condemned, and the primary figures upon whom the community projected its deepest fears. To understand Salem, one must understand how Puritan beliefs about women shaped both suspicion and accusation. In Puritan society, women were expected to be pious, obedient, and submissive. They were to manage households, raise children, and support their husbands, always deferring to male authority in both family and church. A woman who strayed from this model, whether by poverty, temper, or independence, was often viewed as dangerous. To the Puritan imagination, a woman outside her prescribed role could easily become a tool of the devil. Many of the first accused fit this pattern. Sarah Good, the beggar, was poor, angry, and defiant. Sarah Osborne had defied custom by remarrying and disputing her family's inheritance. Bridget Bishop wore bright clothing, ran a tavern, and lived with a boldness that offended Puritan modesty. Their lives defied expectations, and when fear needed a target, they were ready-made suspects. At the same time, the afflicted, the girls who convulsed, screamed, and accused, were also female. In their suffering, they inverted the usual expectations of silence and obedience. Their voices, usually dismissed or ignored, suddenly commanded the attention of magistrates and ministers. In a society that gave young women little authority, The trials created a space where their cries carried the weight of life and death. This dynamic created a cycle. Women accused women, and the court reinforced the notion that female disorder was evidence of witchcraft. The trials became a stage upon which the struggle over gender roles played out under the guise of religion. Yet, the crisis also revealed contradictions. While many women were condemned for stepping outside of Puritan norms, others were accused precisely because they conformed too well, because they were pious, devout, and respected, making them targets of envy or fear. No role, it seemed, was safe. Whether too bold or too obedient, too poor or too prosperous, too visible or too invisible, women were vulnerable from every angle. The Salem Witch Trials were not only about fear of the devil, they were also about the anxieties of a patriarchal society, uncertain of how to contain women's voices and roles. In that crucible of fear, suspicion turned to persecution, and women bore the heaviest burden of Salem's wrath. At first, the witchcraft panic seemed to follow a familiar pattern. Women stood at the center of suspicion, but as the hysteria deepened, the net widened. Soon, men too found themselves accused, proving that no one in Salem was beyond the reach of fear. In Puritan thought, men were meant to embody authority, heads of households, leaders in the church, protectors of the community. For this reason, it shocked many when accusations began to fall on them as well. But the trials showed no consistent logic. The same anxieties that marked women as witches could, under the right circumstances, condemn men too. Some were accused because of family ties. Husbands of suspected witches found themselves implicated, their authority questioned if they failed to control their wives. Sons and fathers were drawn in by association, as if witchcraft ran like an infection through bloodlines. Others were accused for their wealth, their influence, or their disputes with powerful neighbors. Salem's old quarrels did not discriminate by gender. Men who stood on the wrong side of feuds were just as vulnerable to the devil's supposed mark. One of the most shocking developments was the accusation of respected figures, ministers, landowners, and even members of the church found themselves named. If the devil could infiltrate even the most pious families, then no reputation could guarantee safety. To some, these accusations seemed to confirm the scale of the conspiracy. To others, it was the first flicker of doubt. Men's imprisonment strained the colony in new ways. Farms lay abandoned when both husband and wife were jailed. Children wandered without guardians. The community's fragile economy suffered as able-bodied men languished in cells. The trials, once justified as a means of protection, were now undermining the very survival they claimed to safeguard. The accusation of men marked an escalation in Salem's panic. What began as a purge of women who challenged Puritan norms had grown into something larger, a consuming hysteria where anyone, man, woman, or child, could be branded as a servant of Satan. And with this expansion, the trials marched steadily toward their most infamous case, the brutal ordeal of Giles Corey, a man who refused to bend to the court's authority. Among all the grim stories of the Salem Witch Trials, none is remembered with more horror than the death of Giles Corey. His ordeal became a symbol of both resistance and brutality, a reminder of how far Salem's pursuit of witches had spiraled beyond reason. Corey was an elderly farmer in his early 80s, known for his stubbornness and his frequent disputes with neighbors. He was not widely loved, but he was respected as a man who spoke his mind and stood his ground. When his wife, Martha Corey, was accused of witchcraft, Giles himself came under suspicion. Soon he too was charged with consorting with the devil. Brought before the court, Corey refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. His refusal was not simply defiance, it was a calculated decision. Under English law, if he pled and was convicted, his property could be seized, leaving his children with nothing. By remaining silent, he denied the court the power to legally confiscate his estate. But this silence carried a terrible price. The law permitted a brutal form of punishment known as pressing, a method intended to force a prisoner to speak. Corey was stripped, laid in a pit, and heavy wooden boards were placed across his chest. On top of the boards, weights and stones were gradually added, pressing the air from his lungs, crushing bone and muscle. Day after day, he lay under this torture, his body breaking under the unbearable weight. Witnesses recalled that when urged to enter a plea, he responded only with 2 words: more weight. Whether spoken in defiance or simply reported later as legend, those words captured his unyielding resistance. After 2 agonizing days, Giles Corey was crushed to death, the only man in American history executed in this manner. His death shocked even some who supported the trials. To many, it showed the extremity of Salem's justice, a cruelty that went beyond punishment into something darker. But to the court, Corey's silence was proof of guilt. His refusal to plead, they claimed, revealed his allegiance to the devil. In truth, Corey's ordeal revealed the deeper tragedy of Salem. Fear had not only consumed the innocent, but had also twisted the law itself into an instrument of torture. His body was broken beneath stones, but his property passed to his heirs as he had hoped. In that sense, his final act was not surrender but defiance, one last protest against a system determined to crush him. The Salem Witch Trials are often remembered for the executions of adults, but one of the most haunting aspects of the crisis was how deeply it ensnared children. Not only were children the chief accusers, the afflicted girls whose screams carried convictions, but some were also among the accused. In Puritan belief, children were not shielded from spiritual danger, though they were considered innocent in many ways. They were also thought vulnerable to the devil's influence. If Satan could attack a minister's daughter or niece, he could surely tempt other young souls. And in 1692, that fear turned suspicion toward children themselves. Several were arrested and imprisoned. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was one of the most tragic cases. Accusers claimed they saw her specter biting and tormenting them. Under questioning, the terrified child supposedly confessed to having a pet snake given by the devil. Dorothy was thrown into a jail cell, where she remained for months, separated from her mother, until Sarah's execution. The ordeal left her deeply traumatized, scarred, long after the trials ended. Other children were caught in the storm. Indirectly, sons and daughters of accused witches were left to fend for themselves, their family names forever stained. Orphans wandered the village, dependent on reluctant neighbors for survival. For many, childhood ended abruptly in those months, replaced by hunger, grief, and shame. The use of children as accusers also unsettled some observers. Their dramatic fits and spectral visions commanded the full attention of judges and ministers, giving them a level of influence unheard of in Puritan society. But not everyone trusted them. Some suspected that the girls exaggerated or even invented their torments. Others believed the devil manipulated them to deceive the court. Yet in the fevered climate of Salem, their testimonies were rarely doubted. Children were both the instruments and the victims of Salem's hysteria. Their cries condemned neighbors to death. Their confessions, wrung from fear, filled jails with the innocent, and their suffering, whether as accusers or accused, showed how completely the trials had devoured the community, leaving no age untouched. Behind the walls of Salem's jails, the reality of the witchcraft panic was laid bare. Dozens of men, women, and even children were locked in crude, overcrowded cells. The prisons of 17th century Massachusetts were not built for so many, nor for such long confinements. What unfolded inside was a grim world of hunger, disease, and despair. The accused were shackled in heavy iron chains, sometimes nailed to the floors of their cells to prevent escape. Prisoners slept on damp straw or cold stone, their bodies bruised from the restraints. Food was not guaranteed. Families were expected to provide for their jailed relatives, often at great cost. If no family came, the prisoners went hungry. Even when food was brought, jailers sometimes demanded payment before allowing it inside. The cold of New England winters seeped through the walls, while summer heat turned the air suffocating. Filth accumulated in corners, and sickness spread rapidly. Some of the accused died before they ever reached trial, their names lost in the shadow of more famous cases. Others emerged alive, but permanently weakened, carrying scars of malnutrition and illness long after their release. The cost of imprisonment also devastated families. Relatives of the accused were forced to sell property, livestock, or heirlooms to cover prison fees, which included charges for shackles, straw bedding, and even the jailer's time. Some families were ruined financially, stripped of the very farms that sustained them. Inside the cells, despair and fear mingled with quiet resistance. Some prisoners prayed endlessly, clinging to their faith. Others confessed under pressure, hoping to save themselves by accusing others. A few, like Giles Corey, refused to yield, choosing silence or defiance even at the risk of death. The jails became a mirror of Salem itself, divided, fearful, and consumed by the weight of suspicion. For the people outside, the sight of packed prisons only fueled the panic. To them, the overflowing cells confirmed that the devil's servants were everywhere, hiding in plain sight until the light of the court exposed them. But for those inside, prison was its own execution, slow, grinding, and merciless. In Salem, the gallows claimed lives quickly, the jails destroyed them slowly. By the autumn of 1692, faint cracks began to show in the wall of hysteria that had gripped Salem. At first, nearly everyone had accepted the trials as a necessary battle against Satan's agents. But as the months dragged on, some began to question the evidence, the process, and even the very foundations of the panic. The doubts arose slowly, often in whispers. Neighbors noticed that some of the accused were far from the usual outcasts. They were respected church members, wealthy landowners, even close relatives of ministers. If the devil truly sought followers, would he really choose the pious and well-connected as his allies? The sheer scale of accusations, once taken as proof of a vast conspiracy, began to seem suspicious in itself. Spectral evidence, once embraced without question, also faced growing criticism. A few ministers warned that if Satan could take any form he pleased, then he could just as easily appear as the specter of an innocent person, tricking the afflicted and deceiving the court. If that were true, then countless innocent lives had already been destroyed. These quiet theological debates began to leak into the public sphere, sowing unease. The behavior of the afflicted girls, once seen as miraculous proof of the devil's torment, also began to trouble some observers. Their fits grew more dramatic and theatrical, sometimes triggered by the mere glance of an accused person. To skeptics, their performances seemed less like divine truth and more like manipulation, or at best, the frenzy of young minds caught in the storm of adult fears. Even among the judges and officials, unease began to spread. Some who had once spoken with certainty now hesitated. If mistakes had been made, if innocents had died on the gallows, what would that mean for their own souls and reputations? Salem was not yet ready to abandon the trials, but seeds of doubt had been planted, and in a community that had demanded certainty at every step, even the smallest crack threatened to unravel the fragile structure of fear that held it all together. As summer turned to autumn, the trials took a dangerous and unexpected turn. At first, the accused had largely been the vulnerable, poor women, outcasts, and those already at odds with the community. But by September of 1692, the panic had expanded so far that even Salem's most respected and powerful families came under suspicion. The most striking case was that of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman widely admired for her piety and charity. She was a grandmother, a faithful church member, and the very image of Puritan virtue. When she was accused of witchcraft, many villagers were stunned. At her trial, neighbors signed petitions attesting to her good character, yet the afflicted girls collapsed in violent fits at the mere sight of her, claiming her spirit tormented them. The jury at first found her not guilty, but under pressure from the court and the accusers, the verdict was reversed. Rebecca Nurse was hanged in July, and her execution sent shockwaves through the colony. Others followed. Martha Corey, the wife of Giles Corey, was accused despite her standing as a full member of the church. George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, was charged as the supposed ringleader of the witches. At his execution, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, a feat widely believed to be impossible for a witch. Some in the crowd wept, convinced of his innocence, but the execution went forward. These cases marked a turning point, when suspicion reached the doors of the devout, the wealthy, and the well-connected. Doubt grew louder. If Rebecca Nurse and George Burroughs could be condemned, then truly no one was safe. The trials were no longer a purge of Salem's margins. They were devouring its very core. For the judges and ministers, this escalation was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it seemed to confirm the scale of Satan's conspiracy. On the other, it risked undermining the credibility of the court. If the godliest of citizens could be branded witches, then how could anyone trust the system of accusation and evidence? With every new name drawn from the ranks of the respected, Salem edged closer to collapse. The trials had consumed the weak, but now they threatened to consume the very foundations of Puritan society itself. As the crisis deepened and accusations reached the most respected members of the colony, even the ministers, long the guardians of Puritan order, began to clash over the legitimacy of the trials. Their disagreements revealed not only cracks in religious unity, but also the growing unease with the evidence driving the executions. One of the most vocal defenders of the trials was Cotton Mather, the influential Boston minister. Mather believed fervently in the reality of witchcraft and saw Salem's events as part of a larger battle between God and Satan. He argued that the afflicted girl's visions and torments should not be dismissed, since the devil's work was often invisible and deceptive. In his writings and letters, he urged the court to remain vigilant and uncompromising, lest the colony fall under Satan's control. But Mather's own father, Increase Mather, offered a starkly different perspective. Increase was equally devout, but he grew uneasy with the reliance on spectral evidence, the testimony of dreams, visions, and unseen spirits. He warned that the devil could easily impersonate the innocent, creating illusions to condemn the godly. In his words, it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This divide within the ministry unsettled the colony. Puritans looked to their ministers for unity and certainty, yet now they heard conflicting messages from the most respected pulpits in Massachusetts. Some clung to Cotton's warnings, believing that hesitation would only invite more evil. Others leaned toward Increase's caution, fearing that the courts were condemning the innocent under the guise of protecting the faithful. These disagreements did not end the trials immediately, but they planted doubt in powerful places. If even the Mathers, 2 of the most prominent religious voices in New England, could not agree, then how reliable was the foundation upon which the court had built its deadly judgments? The unity of faith that had once fueled the trials was beginning to unravel, and with it, Salem's hysteria was inching closer to collapse. By the late months of 1692, Salem was a community worn thin. What had begun as a burst of righteous zeal was now an endless cycle of accusations, imprisonments, and executions. At first, villagers had spoken in fearful whispers. Then they had rushed to testify, to point fingers, to protect themselves by condemning others. But as the trials dragged on, a different mood began to set in: exhaustion. The daily rhythm of life was collapsing. Fields lay untended because farmers were in prison or too afraid to work beside neighbors they no longer trusted. Families were shattered, some mourning loved ones already executed, others wasting away in jails, still others living under the stigma of suspicion. The costs of supporting prisoners drained households to ruin. Cows wandered, crops withered, children begged, and entire farms fell into disrepair. Accusations, once shocking, began to feel endless. Every week brought new names, new arrests, new cries in the meeting house. But with each new trial, the line between guilt and innocence grew harder to see. People began to wonder, how many witches could there truly be in one village? And if even the godly, ministers, grandmothers, landowners could be condemned, then what meaning did any of it hold? The afflicted girls, once the center of attention, were losing some of their grip on the community's imagination. Their fits had grown more theatrical, their accusations broader and wilder. To some, their testimonies still seemed sacred. To others, they were beginning to ring hollow. The sheer volume of their claims, strained belief, and quiet doubts circulated that perhaps the devil was not in the accused at all, but in the frenzy of the accusations themselves. Meanwhile, executions on Gallows Hill became grimly routine. Where once crowds had gathered in awe, now many came in weary silence. The spectacle had lost its power to reassure. Instead, it deepened the grief and uncertainty that already hung heavy in the village. Salem was tired of fear, tired of death, tired of the endless hunt that devoured its own people. And in that exhaustion lay the first true chance for the hysteria to finally break. By October of 1692, Salem's hysteria had reached its peak and its breaking point. The court of Oyer and Terminer, once the colony's weapon against witchcraft, had become a source of unease and controversy. Its reliance on spectral evidence, its steady stream of death sentences, and its willingness to condemn even the most respected citizens now stirred more dread than confidence. The turning point came when accusations reached into the highest circles of society. Even the wife of Governor William Phips was whispered about as a possible witch. For the governor, who had largely supported the trials from a distance, this was intolerable. If suspicion could fall on his own household, then clearly no one was safe. The trials were no longer protecting the colony, they were consuming it. At the same time, leading ministers, including Increase Mather, publicly criticized the court's methods. Their warnings that spectral evidence was unreliable gained traction, especially as respected citizens like Rebecca Nurse and George Burroughs had died proclaiming their innocence. Salem's unity, already fragile, was fracturing under the weight of doubt. Governor Phips acted. On October 29th, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. Its proceedings ended abruptly, halting the cycle of new trials and executions. In its place, a new court was later established, the Superior Court of Judicature, which refused to admit spectral evidence as valid testimony. Without that crucial tool, the machinery of accusation lost its power. The decision did not immediately free those still imprisoned, nor did it erase the deaths that had already occurred, but it marked the beginning of the end. The gallows, which had loomed so heavily over Salem that summer, would claim no more lives after the last executions in September. For the survivors, the governor's decision was both a relief and a bitter reminder. The court had ended, but only after months of fear, 20 executions, and countless lives scarred forever. The frenzy had burned itself out, leaving behind a village broken, grieving, and haunted by the question of how it had gone so far. When the court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved, Salem's gallows fell silent, but the jails remained crowded with the accused, men, women, and even children who had endured months in chains, waiting for trials that would never come. Now, at last, their fates shifted. One by one, the cells began to open, and the prisoners were released. Freedom, however, did not mean restoration. Many emerged gaunt and sickly, their bodies weakened by disease, malnutrition, and cold. Some carried scars on wrists and ankles where shackles had bitten into flesh. Infants who had spent their earliest months in dark cells were returned to families who scarcely recognized them. The psychological toll was harder still. Those who survived carried the weight of shame, suspicion, and grief. Release also came with a cruel burden. The colony required prisoners to pay for the cost of their own imprisonment, the food, shackles, and straw bedding provided during their confinement. Families who had already sold livestock, tools, and land to sustain loved ones now faced new debts. Some were unable to reclaim their farms, left destitute by a system that had condemned them without proof and then charged them for the privilege of survival. The social scars ran even deeper. For many, freedom did not erase suspicion. Neighbors who had testified against them still lived next door. Old accusations lingered in whispers, staining reputations for years. Children of the accused grew up marked by the shadow of their parents' supposed crimes. Still, the emptying of the jails marked a turning point. It was the first visible sign that the hysteria was truly over. No more names were added to the lists. No more trials filled the meeting house. No more executions haunted Gallows Hill. What remained was silence and the long, painful work of reckoning with what Salem had done to itself. The devil had not been driven from Massachusetts, but the machinery that claimed to fight him had finally ground to a halt, leaving behind a community struggling to understand its own collapse. Freedom from the jails did not mean freedom from hardship. For many families in Salem, the end of the trials marked the beginning of a new struggle, one fought not in courtrooms or on the gallows, but in the ruins of their livelihoods. The colony required those who had been imprisoned to pay for their confinement. Every shackle, every meal, every scrap of straw bedding came at a cost. Prisoners who had barely survived the cold, hunger, and disease now emerged, burdened with debts they could not hope to repay. Families that had already sold livestock, land, or tools to support their loved ones during imprisonment found themselves stripped of what little remained. Widows faced particular devastation. Husbands executed as witches left behind, estates seized or entangled in legal disputes. Children of the condemned inherited not wealth, but stigma. Some were forced into servitude, their futures narrowed by poverty and suspicion. Entire households collapsed, reduced to dependence on distant relatives or the grudging charity of neighbors. The economic wounds deepened the divisions in the village. Those who had testified against neighbors now sometimes held their land, purchased cheaply when families were desperate. Resentments simmered, but there was little the survivors could do. The trials had not only taken lives, they had redistributed power, property, and influence, often into the hands of those who had played a role in the accusations. Even for those released alive, reintegration was fraught. To be accused of witchcraft left a mark that freedom could not erase. Some former prisoners were welcomed back cautiously, while others lived under a cloud of suspicion for years. The community had turned against them once. Who could guarantee it would not happen again? Salem had silenced the gallows, but it had not healed its wounds. The debts left unpaid were not only financial, they were moral and social, debts of justice, trust, and dignity. And in the years that followed, these unpaid debts would haunt not just Salem, but all of Massachusetts, as the colony struggled to reckon with the cost of its fear. In the months and years after the trials, those who had survived imprisonment began to tell their stories. At first, many were hesitant. Fear still lingered in Salem, and the stigma of being accused did not vanish overnight. But gradually, voices rose from the silence, and the world began to hear what it had been like to live through the terror of 1692. Some spoke of the cruel conditions in prison, iron shackles that cut into their skin, bitter cold that gnawed at their bodies, hunger that hollowed their faces. Others described the humiliation of being paraded before the court, their every word twisted into evidence of guilt. Mothers recounted the agony of being separated from children, some never reunited, after months of captivity. Families who had lost loved ones to the gallows spoke openly of injustice, unable to forget how neighbors' testimonies had sent the innocent to their deaths. Petitions began to circulate, demanding that names be cleared. Survivors and relatives of the condemned signed their names to documents that pleaded for recognition of innocence. Some, like the family of Rebecca Nurse, refused to let her memory be tainted, insisting she had been a faithful servant of God until the end. Others sought restitution for the financial ruin the trials had caused, arguing that the colony bore responsibility for the wrongful accusations. Though not all dared to speak loudly, every testimony that surfaced chipped away at the official story of Salem, that the courts had purged witches from their midst. Instead, a darker truth emerged. The trials had destroyed lives, not through justice, but through fear and error. These voices would not immediately heal Salem, but they became the seeds of memory and reckoning. For the first time, the narrative began to shift, not of witches defeated, but of neighbors betrayed. The survivors' words ensured that the tragedy of 1692 would not vanish into silence, but would echo forward as a warning, carried by those who endured it and lived to tell. Not everyone in Salem found the courage or the will to speak about the witch trials. For many, the events of 1692 became a wound too deep to touch, a shadow they chose to bury rather than confront. Out of this silence grew a culture of avoidance, a collective forgetting that would linger in New England for decades. Families who had supported the trials often kept quiet afterward, unwilling to admit how their accusations had destroyed neighbors. Ministers who had urged vigilance from the pulpit rarely revisited their sermons, hoping their words would fade into the past. Judges, too, sought silence, uneasy with the part they had played in sending innocents to the gallows. Few wanted to confess error, for to do so meant acknowledging not only personal guilt, but also the failure of the very system that had once been seen as the guardian of Puritan society. Even those who had lost loved ones sometimes remained quiet. To speak too openly risked reigniting old animosities or drawing renewed suspicion. Some widows and orphans carried their grief privately, hiding it beneath the daily struggle for survival. Neighbors continued to live side by side with those who had testified against them, their silence masking a web of resentment, guilt, and unease. This culture of silence allowed the village to move forward on the surface, but beneath, it left scars unhealed. Salem never truly reconciled with itself in the years immediately following the trials. Instead, the story lived in whispers, in careful glances, in half-remembered names, in the unspoken weight that hung over the village green and the meeting house pews. It was easier for many to pretend it had never happened at all, yet history does not vanish so easily. Though Salem tried to silence its past, the memory of 1692 would continue to press outward, demanding to be told and retold, not only by survivors, but by future generations who sought to understand how fear could unravel a community so completely. In the aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials, guilt hung heavy over the colony. It was not evenly shared, nor was it always publicly admitted, but for many of the ministers, magistrates, and ordinary villagers who had fueled the hysteria, the shadow of guilt became an inescapable companion. Some of the judges struggled most visibly. Samuel Sewell, one of the magistrates on the court of Oyer and Terminer, later stood before his congregation and publicly confessed his sorrow. In 1697, during a day of fasting and prayer, he acknowledged his role in the deaths of the innocent and begged God's forgiveness. His confession was rare and courageous, a crack of honesty in a wall of silence, but it also underscored how exceptional such admissions were. Most judges, including the stern William Stoughton, never expressed regret. Stoughton defended the court's actions until his death, believing he had served God faithfully. Ministers, too, faced the weight of their words. Cotton Mather continued to defend the trials, arguing that the threat of the devil was real and that the court had acted with good intentions, even if mistakes had been made. His father, Increase Mather, while critical of spectral evidence, still carried the burden of knowing that his warnings had come too late to prevent the deaths. Their reputations would forever be tied to the tragedy, symbols of both faith's power and its dangers. For the ordinary people of Salem, guilt took quieter forms. Neighbors remembered the testimony they had given, statements offered in fear, anger, or envy that had condemned friends and kin. Some wrestled privately with the knowledge that their words had helped send innocents to the gallows. Others buried their shame in silence, unwilling to confront what they had done. This shadow of guilt reached even into the colony's leadership. Governor Phipps, who had created the Court of Oyer and Terminer and then dissolved it, knew his indecision had cost lives. His attempt to move on, without full accountability, left the wound festering. The Salem Witch Trials did not end with the last execution. They lingered in the minds and hearts of those who had taken part, their guilt unspoken but ever present. For some, confession brought a measure of peace. For others, denial was easier than facing the truth. But in every case, the shadow remained, a haunting reminder that once unleashed, fear cannot be easily recalled, and guilt cannot be easily forgotten. While the Salem Witch Trials stand as the most infamous in American history, they were not an isolated event. Across Europe and colonial America, witch hunts had scarred communities for centuries, leaving thousands dead long before Salem's crisis erupted. To place Salem in context is to see it not as a bizarre exception, but as the final chapter in a much older and broader story. In Europe, witch trials reached their height between the 15th and 17th centuries. Germany, France, Scotland, and Switzerland all witnessed brutal purges, where hundreds and sometimes thousands were executed. Entire villages were consumed by fear, accusing one another of pacts with the devil, weather magic, or the power to sicken neighbors and blight fields. Torture was common. Confessions were extracted through unbearable pain, and women made up the overwhelming majority of the condemned. The themes were strikingly familiar: communities under stress, divided by poverty, war, or famine, turned inward to hunt for enemies among themselves. The belief that Satan had armies of human agents provided an explanation for disaster and a justification for violence. The same fears that drove European hunts crossed the Atlantic with the Puritans and found new soil in New England. Yet Salem was unique. By 1692, the age of massive witch hunts in Europe was waning. Skepticism about spectral evidence and the reliability of confessions under torture had begun to spread. Courts in England and elsewhere were growing more cautious, questioning whether belief alone could sustain charges of witchcraft. Salem, in many ways, was an echo of an older era, a late flare of hysteria at the edge of the Atlantic world. But what set Salem apart was not only its timing, but its scale. While European witch hunts often claimed hundreds or thousands of lives, Salem's death toll was 20 by execution, with several more dying in prison. The trials were smaller, but they left an outsized imprint because of the intimacy of the community and the fact that it was a colony still struggling to define itself. In Salem, the hysteria unfolded in plain view among neighbors who depended on one another for survival. Seen against the backdrop of global history, Salem was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its fears, extraordinary in how powerfully its memory endured. Where countless European witch hunts have faded into obscurity, Salem became a symbol, remembered and retold as the cautionary tale of what happens when fear, faith, and authority collide unchecked. Though Salem's trials echoed centuries of European witch hunts, they were shaped by circumstances unique to colonial New England. The crisis was not inevitable. It was the product of a perfect storm of pressures, all converging on a small, divided village at the edge of the wilderness. First, Salem was a community in conflict. Unlike many European witch hunts, which unfolded in large cities or broad regions, Salem's panic erupted in a village already fractured by bitter disputes. Arguments over land boundaries, inheritance, and the independence of Salem village from Salem town had left deep scars. The rivalry between families like the Putnams and the Porters colored every accusation, turning old grudges into new charges of witchcraft. The trials became not only a spiritual battle, but also a weapon in local feuds. Second, Salem was living under extraordinary stress. The 1690s were marked by devastating frontier wars with native tribes, who struck settlements with terrifying raids. Refugees carried stories of slaughter into Salem, fueling the sense that Satan was literally advancing through the wilderness. Political upheaval also played a role. The loss of Massachusetts' original charter and the arrival of a new royal governor left colonists uncertain of their autonomy. Fear of collapse, of families, of communities, of the colony itself ran high. Third, religion in Salem carried a peculiar weight. Puritans believed they were building a city upon a hill, a holy society watched by God and the world. This mission created intense pressure to root out sin and preserve purity. The afflicted girl's strange fits were not viewed as medical mysteries, but as spiritual crises, signs that the devil had breached the walls of God's chosen people. In that worldview, inaction was unthinkable. Finally, the scale of the trials was amplified by the role of children. Unlike in many earlier witch hunts, it was the testimonies of young girls that drove the prosecutions. Their visions and torments became the central evidence, and their voices carried authority far beyond their years. This inversion of power, children shaping the fate of adults, was unique to Salem and gave the hysteria a momentum no one had foreseen. These conditions combined to make Salem different. It was not the largest witch hunt, nor the deadliest, but it was the most intimate and the most revealing, exposing how a community under pressure, fractured by division, and consumed by fear, could turn on itself with devastating speed. To understand how Salem unraveled, it is not enough to look only at politics, religion, or law. The deeper engine of the trials lay in the psychology of fear, the way the human mind, under stress and uncertainty, can magnify danger and create enemies where none exist. The Puritans lived in a world of constant anxiety. Disease, crop failure, and sudden death were daily realities, interpreted not as accidents, but as signs of God's judgment or Satan's attack. In such a setting, fear became a lens that shaped every experience. A barking dog at night, a strange dream, or a neighbor's frown could be loaded with ominous meaning. Fear is contagious, and in Salem it spread like wildfire. The afflicted girl's convulsions and screams triggered terror in onlookers whose own imaginations filled in the gaps. Once the community believed witches were real and active, every unexplained event became confirmation. A cow falling ill, a child stumbling, butter curdling in a churn, all could be explained only by invisible malice. Suggestion played a powerful role. The afflicted often mirrored one another, collapsing into fits at the same moment, crying out in chorus against the accused. This was not necessarily deception. It was the power of collective belief. In a community where the devil's presence was assumed, the mind and body responded in ways that reinforced the fear. The court itself magnified the panic. Each conviction and execution confirmed that witches existed, giving authority to the hysteria. Villagers who might otherwise have doubted remained silent, unwilling to stand against what appeared to be overwhelming evidence. To doubt the trials was to risk being accused oneself, a powerful incentive to join the tide rather than resist it. In the psychology of fear, reason becomes the first casualty. Once the community accepted that Satan was in their midst, suspicion became truth, visions became facts, and denial became guilt. The trials showed how human minds, trapped in fear, can create realities as destructive as any physical enemy. This psychological storm, fear feeding fear, suspicion fueling suspicion, was as deadly as the rope on Gallows Hill. And it is what made Salem's tragedy not only possible, but inevitable once the first accusations were believed. While fear was the fuel of Salem's hysteria, power and ambition steered its course. Beneath the sermons and confessions, the witch trials became an arena where personal grudges, rivalries, and greed found deadly expression. The accusations often reflected the fractures already present in Salem. Families with long-standing disputes over land or inheritance suddenly found new weapons in the trials. A neighbor who once argued over a boundary fence could now be accused of sending her specter to torment cattle. A widow contesting property rights could be branded a witch and stripped of her claim. In many cases, the accusations mirrored old feuds, thinly veiled in the language of spiritual warfare. The Putnam family, in particular, played a central role. Their daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., was one of the most vocal accusers, and her testimony carried weight in court. The Putnams had long been at odds with the Porters and other wealthy families allied with Salem town. The spread of accusations often aligned suspiciously with these rivalries, striking at the Porters' allies and strengthening the Putnams' influence within the village. Officials also wielded power through the trials. Judges like William Stoughton used the crisis to assert authority, positioning themselves as guardians of the colony against Satan's armies. Ministers reinforced their control over congregations, preaching that obedience and vigilance were the only shields against the devil. For some, the trials were less about protecting Salem and more about securing their own standing in a community racked with division. Greed was another silent motivator. When the accused were imprisoned, their property was often seized or left abandoned. Neighbors who had once envied fertile fields or sturdy homes suddenly found opportunities to acquire them cheaply. The trials, in effect, reshaped Salem's map of wealth and land ownership, transferring resources from the condemned to the survivors. None of this was admitted openly. Of course, publicly, the trials were about rooting out evil, but beneath the surface, power and corruption coursed through them, ensuring that fear alone was not the only reason for Salem's collapse. Fear opened the door, but ambition, rivalry, and greed pushed it wide. At its heart, the tragedy of Salem was not only about fear or power, it was about the fragility of faith when pressed under the weight of human weakness. The Puritans had crossed the Atlantic with a vision to build a society pure in its devotion to God, a city upon a hill that would shine as an example to the world. Yet in Salem, that vision faltered. The very intensity of their faith made them vulnerable because they believed Satan was real, present, and cunning. Every misfortune could be read as evidence of his hand. Because they believed purity must be defended at all costs, suspicion became virtue and doubt became sin. The strength of their devotion left little room for uncertainty, and in that absence of doubt, fear became absolute. But faith, in practice, collided with the realities of human nature. Ministers argued with one another, undermining the unity they preached. Judges allowed ambition and pride to cloud their judgment, insisting on the righteousness of their actions, even as innocents died. Neighbors used the language of religion to mask envy, greed, or vengeance. The desire to serve God merged with the flaws of humanity, producing a storm that destroyed the very community it sought to protect. The executions revealed the contradiction most starkly. The condemned often died with prayers on their lips, professing innocence until the end. If the Puritans truly believed witches could not call upon God, then the sight of these prayers should have given pause. Yet faith, so rigidly applied, became blind to its own contradictions. The more fragile it proved, the more harshly it was enforced. In the end, Salem's tragedy was not the collapse of faith, but the distortion of it. What had begun as a mission to create a godly community became a mirror of humanity's flaws: fear, ambition, envy, and pride, all cloaked in the language of devotion. The Puritans had dreamed of a community set apart from the corruption of the world. In Salem, they discovered that corruption was not only outside their walls, but within them, woven into the very fabric of their society. Their faith had promised strength, but in its fragility, it helped pave the road to one of history's most haunting episodes. When the gallows fell silent and the jails emptied, Salem did not simply return to normal life. The trials left a scar so deep that the community could never fully escape it. In the years that followed, the memory of 1692 began to shift from a local tragedy to a symbol, a story told and retold, carrying meaning far beyond the village itself. At first, the memory was one of shame. Families who had lost loved ones grieved quietly, while those who had participated in the accusations often tried to bury the past. But history has a way of refusing silence. Over time, petitions for justice forced the colony to confront what had happened. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of many who had been condemned, offering compensation to some of their heirs. It was a small step, but it acknowledged that wrong had been done. As decades passed, Salem's story began to spread more widely. Writers, ministers, and politicians invoked the witch trials as cautionary tales. For some, they illustrated the dangers of unchecked religious zeal. For others, they stood as proof of the human tendency to destroy itself in times of fear. The names of the condemned, Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, Jules Corey, were remembered not as witches, but as victims of hysteria and injustice. Salem itself carried the weight of the memory uneasily. For generations, descendants of both the accused and the accusers lived side by side, bound together by a history they could not forget. The story became part of the town's identity, shaping how outsiders viewed it and how its own people understood their past. By the 19th century, with the rise of American literature and reform movements, the Salem Witch Trials had become more than a local story. They were a national symbol. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, himself a descendant of one of the judges, used the trials to explore themes of guilt, sin, and the weight of history. Later, Arthur Miller's play The Crucible would turn Salem into a metaphor for modern political fear, ensuring the story's relevance for new generations. What had once been a community's private shame had become part of America's collective memory. Salem was remembered not only for its tragedy, but for its lesson that fear, left unchecked, can corrupt even the most faithful society. For generations after 1692, Salem lived under the shadow of its past. Families carried the weight of lost loved ones, and the town itself bore a reputation steeped in shame. The witch trials were not a story proudly told. They were a burden quietly endured. But over time, as the raw wound faded into history, Salem began to transform that dark chapter into something else, a source of identity, and eventually, of commerce. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Salem became known for its role in maritime trade, its bustling harbor, and its wealthy merchants. The witch trials were still remembered, but they were not the town's defining feature. It was only later, as the nation grew more fascinated with its colonial past, that Salem's role in 1692 returned to prominence. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose ancestor Judge John Hathorne had presided over the trials, wove the themes of guilt and sin into their work, ensuring the trials were not forgotten. By the 19th century, with the rise of tourism and historical curiosity, Salem's dark history began to draw visitors. Travelers came to see the sites where the trials had unfolded, eager to stand where fear had once consumed a community. The town, slowly, began to embrace its past rather than hide from it. Monuments were erected, and historical societies worked to preserve the memory of the condemned. In the 20th century, this transformation accelerated. Salem became synonymous with witches, not as a community destroyed by hysteria, but as a destination steeped in legend. Museums, reenactments, and guided tours sprang up, blending history with folklore. Halloween celebrations turned the once shameful story into a spectacle, drawing crowds from across the country. The word Salem itself became a brand, attached to everything from souvenirs to television shows. This shift was not without tension. For some descendants of the condemned, the commercialization of Salem's tragedy felt like a betrayal of memory. But for the town itself, embracing the witch trials became a way to survive and thrive, turning infamy into opportunity. What had once been a mark of disgrace was now a symbol of history, of mystery, of identity. Salem had moved from shame to tourism, proving once more how stories, even of suffering, can be reshaped by time into something entirely new. The Salem witch trials did not remain confined to court records or family memories. Over time, they became a powerful source of inspiration for writers, poets, and playwrights who used the story to explore themes far larger than Salem itself. Through literature, the trials were reimagined, retold, and woven into the cultural fabric of America. One of the earliest and most significant voices was Nathaniel Hawthorne, a 19th century writer born in Salem. Hawthorne carried a personal connection to the trials. His ancestor, Judge John Hathorne, had been one of the magistrates who condemned witches to death. This legacy haunted Hawthorne, shaping his work. In novels like The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables, he explored the themes of guilt, inherited sin, and the weight of history, echoes of the shame that Salem carried. Through Hawthorne, the witch trials were transformed from local tragedy into symbols of moral struggle and human weakness. In the 20th century, Salem's story took on new meaning in the work of Arthur Miller. His play The Crucible, written in 1953 during the era of McCarthyism, used the witch trials as an allegory for the Red Scare and the hunt for communists in America. Miller drew direct parallels between Salem's hysteria and the modern climate of fear, showing how suspicion and paranoia could destroy communities. The play gave the trials a new life, ensuring that each generation would see in Salem not only history but also reflection, a mirror of their own anxieties. Beyond Hawthorne and Miller, countless other works of literature, both historical and fictional, drew on Salem's legacy. Poets wrote of the gallows, novelists reimagined the lives of the accused, and historians chronicled the trials in painstaking detail. The story's combination of fear, injustice, and human frailty proved endlessly compelling. Through literature, Salem's witch trials became more than an event. They became a metaphor. Writers used them to explore not just Puritan New England, but the universal dangers of fear, conformity, and the abuse of power. And in doing so, they ensured that the voices silenced in 1692 would continue to speak through pages and stages, long after Salem itself had tried to forget. The Salem Witch Trials were not only a tragedy of faith and fear, they were also a profound lesson in the dangers of flawed justice. Out of the wreckage of 1692 emerged a recognition that courts must be bound by reason, evidence, and restraint, or risk repeating Salem's mistakes. These lessons would echo through American legal thought for centuries. One of the clearest outcomes was the rejection of spectral evidence. In Salem, the testimony of visions and dreams had been enough to condemn neighbors to death, but after the trials ended, many ministers, judges, and lawmakers admitted that such evidence was dangerously unreliable. If the devil could assume the shape of innocent people, then no one was safe from false accusation. The ban on spectral evidence became an early step toward demanding more tangible proof in criminal cases. Another lesson came from the absence of legal protections for the accused. In Salem, defendants had no right to counsel, no guarantee of impartial juries, and no way to cross-examine their accusers. The trials demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of a system where accusation itself was treated as near proof of guilt. Over time, this recognition helped shape the American legal principle of innocent until proven guilty. The hysteria also underscored the danger of confessions under pressure. Many accused witches confessed only after facing threats of death or promises of reprieve. Their false confessions, in turn, fueled further accusations, expanding the panic. Later legal reforms placed greater emphasis on protecting individuals from coercion and ensuring that confessions were truly voluntary. Even the separation of church and state, which would become a cornerstone of American democracy, found a cautionary lesson in Salem. The trials showed the peril of allowing religious zeal to dictate law. Ministers, though influential, had played too large a role in shaping the court's actions. The blurring of spiritual belief with civil authority had created a system vulnerable to hysteria. Though the framers of the US Constitution lived nearly a century after Salem, the story of the trials remained part of New England's memory. As America built its legal system, the ghosts of Salem served as a warning. Justice must be grounded in fairness, evidence, and restraint, or it ceases to be justice at all. As time passed, Salem's tragedy grew into more than history. It became a warning. Generations of Americans looked back on 1692 not simply as a tale of witches and Puritans, but as a symbol of what happens when fear overtakes reason, when communities abandon evidence for suspicion, and when hysteria is allowed to govern justice. The witch trials were invoked during moments of collective panic, whenever society searched for scapegoats in times of uncertainty. In the 1950s, during the Red Scare and Senator McCarthy's hunt for communists, Arthur Miller's The Crucible drew a direct parallel. Salem's accusations of witchcraft mirrored America's accusations of disloyalty, where careers and reputations were destroyed by rumor and suspicion. The lesson was clear. What had happened in a small Puritan village centuries earlier could happen again, under a different name. Beyond politics, Salem became shorthand for the psychology of crowds. The term witch hunt entered the American vocabulary, used to describe any campaign driven more by fear, prejudice, or vengeance than by truth. From civil rights struggles to debates about free speech, Salem's ghost reappeared whenever people were condemned without fair hearing. The trials also offered a universal warning about human nature. They showed how quickly fear can overwhelm logic, how ordinary people, neighbors, friends, even family, can turn against one another when survival feels at stake. And they revealed how authority, once consumed by panic, can legitimize the destruction of the innocent. Salem's story endures precisely because it is not unique. The details belong to 1692, but the pattern, fear fueling hysteria, hysteria feeding power, and power crushing the vulnerable, belongs to every age. Each retelling asks the same question: when fear rises again, will we recognize it for what it is, or will we repeat the mistakes of Salem? Though the Salem Witch Trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, their echoes can still be felt in modern America. Salem's tragedy is not frozen in the past. It reverberates whenever fear overwhelms reason, whenever suspicion becomes proof, and whenever communities fracture under the weight of paranoia. In times of national crisis, the shadow of Salem often resurfaces. During the Red Scare of the 20th century, neighbors denounced neighbors, careers were destroyed, and accusations alone carried devastating weight. In the aftermath of terrorist attacks, entire communities were eyed with suspicion, judged not by actions, but by associations. The language may change, but the pattern remains hauntingly familiar. Fear creates enemies, and once enemies are named, justice bends beneath the weight of panic. Even beyond politics, the ghost of Salem lingers in everyday discourse. The phrase witch hunt is now common in American culture, used to describe investigations or accusations seen as unfair, exaggerated, or driven by hidden agendas. Though sometimes applied loosely, the term always carries the memory of Salem's hysteria, a reminder of what happens when fear replaces fact. The story also echoes in debates about authority and accountability. Salem shows how easily institutions meant to protect can become instruments of harm when leaders are consumed by certainty instead of guided by caution. Courts, ministers, and officials in 1692 believed they were saving their community. In truth, they were destroying it. That lesson continues to challenge Americans to question how power is used in moments of fear. And in the private sphere, Salem reflects the fragility of trust. Just as neighbors once turned on neighbors, modern communities wrestle with division, suspicion, and the temptation to scapegoat the vulnerable. Salem's legacy reminds us that the cost of turning against one another is always greater than the threat we imagine. In every age, Salem's story poses the same challenge. Will we learn from its echoes, or will we repeat them under new names? The story of Salem is often told as a relic of a distant, superstitious past. Yet beneath its colonial setting lies a tension that is still alive today, the struggle between faith and fear, between belief and doubt, between the desire for certainty and the fragility of human judgment. In Salem, faith was the cornerstone of community life. It bound neighbors together, gave meaning to hardship, and offered hope in a harsh and uncertain world. But that same faith, when paired with fear, became a weapon. Instead of uniting the people, it divided them. Instead of protecting the innocent, it condemned them. The tragedy of 1692 reveals how belief, when fused with fear and authority, can be twisted into justification for cruelty. That pattern is not confined to the past. In every generation, communities wrestle with the same tension. Belief, whether religious, political, or cultural, offers strength, but it also demands responsibility. When fear seeps into that belief, it can harden into dogma, closing minds to doubt and compassion. Leaders may use it to rally power, just as judges and ministers did in Salem. Ordinary people may cling to it for safety, even when it leads to injustice. The trials remind us that faith and fear are uneasy companions. Faith seeks certainty, but fear thrives on uncertainty. Together, they can create an atmosphere where suspicion feels righteous and doubt feels dangerous. Salem's story is not simply about Puritans. It is about the human impulse to seek control in the face of chaos, and the terrible price that impulse can exact when left unchecked. Even now, in moments of social tension, we see how quickly fear can shape narratives, and how easily belief can be used to divide. Salem stands as a warning that faith, if not tempered with humility and reason, can become fragile, and in that fragility, destructive. The people of Salem believed they were defending their community and their God. Instead, fear twisted their devotion into tragedy. That lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1692. Whenever faith and fear walk hand in hand, we must tread carefully, for the line between conviction and cruelty is perilously thin. The Salem Witch Trials are often remembered in numbers: 20 executed, more than 100 accused, hundreds more scarred by suspicion. But behind those statistics were human lives: mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, each with their own stories, families, and hopes. To reduce them to figures is to miss the true cost of Salem's hysteria. Rebecca Nurse was a 71-year-old grandmother, frail in health, but strong in faith. She was known for her kindness, her devotion to her family, and her reputation for piety. Yet she was dragged to the gallows, condemned despite widespread doubt about her guilt. Her execution left not only grief, but a lingering sense of injustice that haunted Salem for generations. Martha Corey, wife of Giles Corey, was a full member of the church, a status that should have protected her. Her faith and independence marked her as unusual, and for that she was accused, imprisoned, and hanged. Sarah Good, poor and desperate, had long struggled to survive with her young daughter Dorothy at her side. She was executed as a witch, while her child languished in prison, traumatized beyond recovery. George Burroughs, once a minister in Salem Village, stood on the gallows and recited the Lord's Prayer with perfect clarity. The crowd gasped, knowing that witches were believed incapable of such devotion. Yet even that powerful display could not save him. He was executed, leaving many uneasy and doubtful. And then there was Giles Corey, pressed to death beneath stones, his silence a final act of defiance against a court that demanded his submission. His death was slow and brutal, but it preserved his family's inheritance and became a symbol of resistance in the face of tyranny. Each life lost was more than a name on a list. Each was a person torn from family, stripped of dignity, and condemned not for crimes committed, but for fears projected onto them by neighbors and authority figures. The real human cost of Salem was not just the deaths, but the fractures left behind. Children growing up without parents, families ruined financially, communities divided by betrayal and grief. The witch trials remind us that history is not measured only in outcomes or laws, but in the lives of ordinary people. Salem's tragedy was not only about witches and trials, it was about human beings consumed by fear and the terrible suffering it inflicted on those least able to defend themselves. In the centuries after 1692, Salem slowly transformed from a village haunted by tragedy into a cultural touchstone, its name forever tied to the witch trials. What began as a story of shame and silence became, over time, a source of identity, shaped by history, literature, and eventually, commerce. For years after the executions, Salem lived uneasily with its past. The trials were not spoken of openly. Too many families bore guilt, too many wounds remained fresh. But as generations passed, the story began to move from memory into history. Descendants of the accused petitioned for justice, and historians uncovered court records, piecing together the events of that fateful year. Salem's tragedy slowly shifted from lived pain to recorded lesson. By the 19th century, the town's identity began to intertwine with its history. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, burdened by his family's connection to Judge Hathorne, brought themes of guilt and inherited sin into American literature. Later, Arthur Miller's The Crucible would turn Salem into a metaphor for political hysteria, ensuring the trials remained relevant for modern audiences. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Salem embraced its past in a new way. The trials became the foundation of a thriving tourism industry. Museums, memorials, and reenactments drew visitors eager to walk the streets where fear once ruled. The town became synonymous with witches, not as figures of terror, but as symbols of history, folklore, and even empowerment. Halloween celebrations turned Salem into a place of spectacle, blending tragedy with festivity in ways that would have astonished its Puritan founders. This transformation was not without tension. Some argued that turning the witch trials into entertainment cheapened the suffering of the accused. Yet others saw it as a way to keep the memory alive, to ensure that the lessons of 1692 were never forgotten. Today, Salem is both a town and a symbol, a place where tragedy, literature, and popular culture converge. Its name evokes not only the darkness of hysteria, but also the resilience of memory. From shame to remembrance, from silence to tourism, Salem has been transformed. But beneath the layers of commerce and storytelling, the human tragedy of 1692 still lingers, whispering its warning across the centuries. The Salem Witch Trials lasted only a matter of months, but their shadow has stretched across centuries. In 1692, fear and faith collided in a small Puritan village, tearing apart families, staining reputations, and leaving 20 people dead on the gallows. Yet the true weight of Salem is not in its numbers, it is in the lesson it left behind. Unmasking Salem means looking beyond the myths of witches and curses to see the reality. Ordinary people, caught in extraordinary fear, destroying one another in the name of safety. It means recognizing how the desire for purity, when fused with panic, can unleash cruelty. And it means acknowledging that the devil Salem fought so fiercely was not a specter in the night, but the very human impulses of envy, pride, fear, and blind certainty. The trials remind us that communities are fragile. They show how quickly trust can fracture, how easily authority can falter, and how swiftly fear can consume reason. They warn that justice without doubt becomes tyranny, and faith without humility becomes destructive. Yet Salem is not only a tale of tragedy, it is also a testament to endurance. Survivors spoke, descendants sought justice, and later generations transformed the story into a symbol, a cautionary tale invoked again and again whenever fear threatens to overwhelm truth. Today, Salem stands as a reminder, etched into American memory, of the cost of hysteria and the resilience of those who endured it. To unmask Salem is to see ourselves within it, for the trials are not only history, they are a mirror, reflecting the dangers that rise whenever fear takes hold and reason falls silent. Their lesson endures because it is not bound to the 17th century, it is timeless. Salem's fields and meeting houses have long since changed, but the echoes of 1692 remain. They whisper through literature, through law, through culture, reminding us that the line between order and chaos, between justice and injustice, is thinner than we think. And they remind us that only by facing fear with clarity and power with restraint can we keep from repeating the tragedy of Salem.